Hi, everyone. I'm Meryl Richards, the moderator for today's live stream webinar, and we're excited today to be launching the CA100 Plus Global Sector Strategies Recommended Investor Expectations for Food and Beverage. I'm the Director of Research on the Food and Forest team at Ceres, which is a nonprofit organization working with the most influential capital market leaders to solve the world's greatest sustainability challenges. Before we start today's session, just a few notes on logistics. First of all, the session is being recorded. This is so that we can provide all participants with a link to the recording shortly after its completion, and you can let any colleagues know who missed the session or weren't able to join that they can also view that, that link after the session. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, we will have a few minutes for Q&A at the very end, so please enter those into the question and answer box at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You can enter them at any time. You don't have to wait for the Q&A session, but when the speakers are speaking, if something comes to mind, feel free to pop that in the box. If you have a technical question, such as trouble with audio, you can also type that into the Q&A box and we'll try to sort it out for you. So I want to thank each of you for participating in today's event, and I'm especially grateful to our speakers, Nako Kobayashi, Rosie Farr, Matthias Nar, and Emily DeMasi for joining us to share their views and experiences. Nako is an associate on the Food and Forest team at Ceres and the lead author of the Global Sector Strategy for the food and beverage sector. At Ceres, she leads research on commodity-driven deforestation and climate commitments in the food sector. She'll be speaking first, and then I'll introduce our other speakers when we get to the panel discussion. So we'll start today with a brief preview by Nako, then Rosie will facilitate a discussion with Matthias and Emily about the climate performance of companies in the food and beverage sector and their priorities for engagement. And as I mentioned, we'll have a few minutes at the end for Q&A before we wrap up. Before we get started, I just want to note that what's really integral to any discussion of the climate transition in the food and beverage sector is the role that natural and working lands play in mitigating climate change. And so I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all Native and Indigenous people globally who have stewarded these lands for generations with attention to both people and the environment. And we do this to affirm our commitment to recognize and respect the rights of Indigenous people around the world, including through our own work. So now over to Nako for a sneak preview of some of the content of the Food and Beverage Sector Report, which launched a couple weeks ago.
Thanks, Meryl, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for being here with us today. As Meryl mentioned, today we're launching the Food and Beverage Sector Strategy of the Global Sector Strategies, which is a new work stream out of the Climate Action 100 Plus initiative. For those of you who may not be familiar with Climate Action 100 Plus, it is an investor initiative that brings together 615 investors with over $55 trillion in assets under management to engage the world's highest emitting companies to drive the business transition to a net zero economy. To help guide investors with their investor engagements on climate change in a wide variety of sectors, the initiative released a net zero company benchmark back in March, which assessed all of the CA100 Plus focused companies on their progress in the transition to net zero future. The benchmark found that 52% of CA100 Plus focused companies have committed to net zero in some capacity, but details on how these commitments will be fulfilled are often left unclear. And in particular, one of the indicators in the benchmark assessed whether the companies have a decarbonization strategy to meet its long and medium term greenhouse gas reduction targets. And this was an indicator that was lagging for many sectors and the food and beverage sector in particular. And without a clear strategy for how a company seeks to decarbonize its operations and its supply chain, they will not be able to achieve any net zero or other greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets that they set. So this is really an important indicator in the overall benchmark. But we do acknowledge that what decarbonization a robust strategy looks like for a company in the steel sector, for example, compared to a food and beverage company will look very different. And so to help investors know what to engage companies on this topic, the Global Sector Strategies workstream was launched. The Global Sector Strategies intend to provide more guidance on not only the decarbonization strategy indicator, but really all of the sector-specific elements of any of the indicators that were in the net zero company benchmark to help investors guide companies to make actions that make sense for their sector. The project does not seek to identify the specific set of actions any individual company in a given sector should take, but really it's meant to direct and guide engagements and set the overall direction for both engagements and actions in this sector. Today, we'll be talking about the food and beverage sector strategy, but I would like to note that there is a steel sector strategy and an aviation sector strategy that's already been released. And you can find that along with this report on the Climate Action 100 Plus website. And there'll be more sector strategies released in the future. And so to get into the content of today's webinar, the recommended investor expectations for food and beverage, the report covers everything from kind of the background of the sector, which specific industries we're talking about, and getting at what the main sources of greenhouse gas emissions are from the sector, and align with that kind of what the main mitigation levers are. We then move into recommended investor expectations, as well as recommended some guidance for investor engagements with companies both within the sector, but also engagements with other sectors that may help accelerate progress in this sector. For example, there's some machinery companies that provide machinery to agricultural producers, and engagements with that can help decarbonize farm production and other engagements of that nature. And I'd like to take this time to help set the context for the discussions to follow by highlighting two of our key messages in the report. The first message is that we will not be able to achieve a 1.5 degree scenario without addressing the emissions from the food and beverage sector. And the second message is that most of the emissions from the sector come from agriculture and land use change. So the diagram that you see on this slide helps explain both of those points. This diagram compares estimates of greenhouse gas emissions from the food sector from two different recent studies that assessed global food systems emissions. Both studies found that food systems contribute significantly to overall global greenhouse gas emissions, one study finding that it's a little over a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions, and the other study found that it was a little over a third of all greenhouse gas emissions coming from food systems. The studies identified the boundaries of food systems slightly differently, but in both cases, they found that agricultural production and land use change are the main sources of emissions in this sector. What this means is that land use change, which could be deforestation or other land use change, such as the conversion of grassland ecosystems like the Cerrado in Brazil, where most of the soybeans are produced, are a significant contributor to emissions from this sector, and companies will not be able to successfully decarbonize or meet their net zero other greenhouse gas emissions targets without addressing the land use change in their supply chains. And land use change happens when land is cleared for the purpose of agricultural production. So when land is cleared, a forest is cut down in order to make space to produce soy or other commodities. The carbon that was stored in the trees gets emitted into the atmosphere, but that land also loses its ability to store more carbon in the future. So it's a significant contributor to climate change. Another key source of emissions in the sector is agricultural non-CO2 emissions, and this refers to all of the emissions that come from livestock production, crop production directly. So this could be methane emissions that can come from enteric fermentation. So that's when cows burp, for example, the methane that's emitted, and also from manure management. Nitrous oxide is another non-CO2 emission from the sector, and that's typically associated with fertilizer use, so a synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, but also could come from methane from manure management. And there's also methane emissions associated with rice production. These emissions are a key contributor to climate change in this sector because compared to carbon dioxide, they have a higher global warming potential, and so they can exacerbate emissions from this sector. A study that is being used as a basis for emerging guidance for companies to set science-based targets for greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets in this sector found that to achieve a 1.5 degree scenario, land-based emissions must be reduced by 85% compared to a business as usual scenario by 2050. It's important to note that not all of these emissions will come from the food sector. There are some emissions from land that come from the forestry sector, for example, but without addressing these emissions within the food and beverage sector, we will not be able to achieve a 1.5 degree scenario. And importantly, most of these emissions reside within the supply chains of companies. So even companies that do not own and operate their own agricultural production, they're still exposed to these emissions through the Scope 3 purchased goods and services emissions as defined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And so these companies are still responsible for addressing these emissions in their supply chain. And based on all of this information, we, along with a scientific advisory committee, investors, and a few companies, put together 6 key actions companies can take in order to align with net zero to address some of the emissions that I just discussed. And we don't have time to get into the details of this today, but just to quickly go over the overall categories, they're integrate climate action into corporate decision-making processes and procurement policies. This is critical. As I just mentioned, most of these emissions come from the supply chain. So embedding climate action within procurement policies and having standards in place for suppliers to comply with is a really key action that companies can take to align with net zero. It's also very important for companies to incentivize and support agriculture producers to reduce the climate impact of their production systems and to enhance agricultural carbon capture. This is critical because most of the emissions come from land use change in agriculture, so it's important to incentivize those actors on the ground who have the ability to be able to mitigate these emissions. It's also critical that companies invest in capital expenditures and other operating expenses to enhance operational supply chain resilience to climate change and engage in consumer behavior change. So this could be instilling new storage capacity to ensure that the supply chains are resilient, and also capital expenditures that are more geared towards incentivizing consumer behavior change by shifting product portfolios to plant-based products, for example. Companies can also mitigate their other emissions, so non-land use emissions, by transitioning to more efficient and renewable energy use, consistent with the actions that are needed for any company in any sector. And they can also improve processing, manufacturing, packaging practices to reduce emissions and food loss. Critically, food loss is also a contributor to emissions because any of the food that is wasted, all of the emissions that went into producing that food is also wasted. And then another key action companies can take in the sector is to partner with peer suppliers and policymakers to drive transformations across the sector. And this is really critical as producers are expected to implement more and more practices to mitigate their emissions. There are going to be many competing asks, and it's really critical that companies across the sector can coordinate their asks so that producers on the ground are being asked to do the same things, to be incentivized to do the same things, so that they're more motivated in order to make these changes, especially when suppliers are shifted around from year to year among different companies. Producers are going to be less likely to want to implement these practices if they aren't sure whether the asks will be the same on a year-by-year basis. So that was a very quick introduction into some of the content of our paper. Please let us know if you have any questions, and I hope this set the stage for the discussion to follow. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Nako. So we'll now move into our facilitated panel discussion. Rosie Farr from PRI will facilitate the discussion. She's a stewardship analyst at PRI. She's responsible for coordinating collaborative engagements, the Climate Action 100 Plus initiative, working with a particular focus on companies in the food and beverage sector. Emily DeMasi is Director of Engagement at EOS at Federated Hermes. She engages in North America with a particular focus on the financial services, healthcare, and retail and consumer services sectors. She also leads the Human Capital Management theme team. Prior to joining the EOS team, she spent nearly a decade in the socially responsible investing field. Matthias is Head Engagement International at Ethos Foundation. He's responsible for the management of the Ethos Engagement Pool International Dialogue Program and Ethos's international engagement activities. Before joining Ethos, Matthias was a manager at Robeco SAM Sustainability Services. Then he worked as an engagement specialist in Robeco's Governance and Active Ownership Department in the Netherlands. So thank you all so much for being with us today, and I'll now turn it over to Rosie.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Meryl and Narco, for the introduction. So as we've already introduced both our speakers, Emily and Matthias, I think we can get right into it. Just a quick note to both Emily and Matthias, I think we can keep this fairly informal, so do both feel free to respond or elaborate on each other's responses. I think for me personally, I think engaging in this sector is particularly exciting because we can really see the power that some of these international food and beverage companies have to shift the industry. There's a huge number of actors involved across each supply chain. And so effectively engaging companies in this space really has the potential to sort of generate an outsized impact. So turning it over to our speakers, perhaps Matthias, if you'd like to start, could you maybe speak a bit about your personal interest in the food and beverage or consumer packaged goods sector and what led you to start engaging in this space?
Yes, thanks, Rosie, for your kind words. So for me, the interest in the food and beverage industry really did start with Nestle, the company. So you're probably all aware of the fact that Nestle is indeed the world's biggest food and beverage company. They have a market cap of over 220 billion Swiss francs and also a huge turnover of around 90 billion Swiss francs per year. So it's indeed just this big, huge food and beverage behemoth. But there's also, of course, the Swiss angle for us as a Swiss-based foundation, and they make up about 20% of the Swiss market index, the main equity index here in Switzerland, and they employ over 10,000 people in Switzerland. So it's also an important part of the Swiss economic fabric, this company. And then, of course, at Ethos, we do have a very long standing history of engaging with them since at least over 20 years. Initially, it was a lot of focus on corporate governance topics, but then we were selected by the Climate Action 100 initiative to take over the lead on Nestle. And then we very quickly realized that the company also has a huge role to play in the global transition to a net zero economy. Of course, as was mentioned by Nako, it's not really in terms of their scope 1 and 2 emissions. I think that's pretty obvious, but it's indeed their scope 3 emissions, which make up at Nestle around 95% of their total emissions. So it's really huge. And I think they do have a lot of leverage to change the practices across and especially upstream their supply chains. So for the past 3 years, we have really been trying to learn as much as possible about this nexus between the food system and climate change and how big companies can use their leverage. So yeah, that's a little bit where we are coming from, more from the company side, then moving into the food system. So really bottom up.
Thanks, Matthias. Yeah, such a long-standing engagement with the company. I think perhaps digging a little bit more into the report now, maybe turning it over to you, Emily. Were there any facts or messages in the report that particularly surprised you?
Yes, thank you, Rosie. As was stated at the beginning, I work for EOS Federated Hermes. We are a global stewardship provider for global institutional investors. We have about 50 global institutional investors that we provide services for with $1.75 trillion worth of assets under advice. And so, you know, this is a space that is growing, I think, for everybody. And as was stated in the introduction, my focus is really on the financial services sector. And there's rightly been a lot of focus on fossil fuel financing and exposure to the oil sector. But I have limited exposure actually to the food and beverage sector, and was actually surprised by the environmental impact concentration within this sector. So some of the facts that came through to me that I found very impactful were, you know, that some analysis suggests that even if all non-food system GHG emissions immediately ceased, that emissions from the food system alone would likely exceed what is needed for a 1.5 degrees scenario analysis. So, you know, I think that it makes you stop and think about how important engagement is in this sector. I was also impressed by the opportunities for emission mitigation in this sector. So things like eliminating deforestation, restoring cleared land, and using agricultural practices that mitigate and sequester carbon has the potential to mitigate more emissions than implementing renewable energy across all sectors. Now, I'm not suggesting we do one or the other, but just to say that this sector alone holds more climate risk and opportunities than I had previously considered.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's a good point. And I think especially important to sort of reflect in investors' engagements when you look at companies are focusing their attention and, you know, the sort of wide range of opportunities that are there for them, as opposed to, like you say, just shifting to renewable energy, for example. And perhaps same question to you, Matthias. Any particularly surprising or exciting findings from the report?
Plenty. So I really enjoy reading through the report. But one thing that really came as a bit of a revelation to me is also just the sheer scale of the mitigation potential also downstream. I mean, upstream, I think we were keenly aware, but downstream, I think, was really interesting. I think one angle was indeed the consumers. It's really important for the consumers to shift to a plant-based diet. And this is also something we've actually had on our radar and we're already discussing with Nestle. And I think the company, they did make some announcements around this, and I think they made some progress in changing their product portfolio also towards plant-based. I think in their roadmap, which came out about a year ago, they actually say that by 2030, they want to take out 1.4 million tons of CO2 from the atmosphere by just shifting to plant-based foods. So I think that angle was maybe a little bit less surprised, but the angle that was for me a real surprise, and I think it's something where we have a lot of work to do as investors, but also as food sector, or let's say the industry, is indeed the food waste angle. I think that's potentially a huge potential and a lever. And I think it has been a bit of a surprise, and I think maybe even a bit of it's a bit neglected by the industry. So I think there is a lot of food waste issues to be tackled, and the industry, I think, has a lot of work to do, especially on that specific angle. And that was a bit of a surprise to me indeed.
Yeah, definitely. I think huge, as the report shows, yeah, huge potential there. Definitely in the engagements that I've been working with, there are some perhaps stickier questions involved with the sort of downstream emissions side, but nonetheless very important to get stuck into addressing. Sorry. So yes, perhaps among the investor recommended expectations that come out of the report, Matthias, which areas do you think, perhaps drawing on your experience engaging companies, are there any areas where companies have been making progress? So any examples you found particularly promising? I know you've mentioned Nestle already.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have to refer to them again, because it's the company I know now very well due to our engagement on this issue over the last 3 years. And I must say, I think they're quite the leader in this space. It's I think their decarbonization strategy is quite convincing. What I especially like, it's very hands-on and concrete, and the levers that they want to use to achieve their target is quite clearly outlined, and specific milestones are defined, especially on deforestation. I think they've come a long way. They now monitor their whole supply chain, especially the palm oil supply chain. They now monitor it. They use Starling, which is a monitoring system by Airbus. It uses satellite imagery in real time. So I think it's, in terms of commitment and technological approach that they have taken, it's quite convincing. The second aspect I quite like in the strategy is also the really hard push of Nestle into regenerative agriculture. And what they do is they help a lot upstream their suppliers, especially on the smallholder side. They try to help them and they try to teach them how to improve the way agriculture is done. And I think what they're really trying to push into their supply chain is to take an approach which is a lot less linear, but a lot more circular. And I think that makes sense to have this focus on scaling up good agricultural practices, such as the planting of cover crops and the use of organic fertilizers, and even the rotation of multiple crops, which is not widely done, especially in emerging markets. So I think that's, in my view, quite convincing.
Yeah, definitely. The Nestle's roadmap definitely has, like you say, many of these strategy in place. It has such a comprehensive overview of its whole supply chain and, strategies in place at every point. So yeah, that's certainly something I think that can be applied more broadly within the sector. Maybe flipping it over to the other side, Emily, are there any areas in particular where you think companies are lagging in the sense of the investor expectations from the report?
Yeah, definitely. To Matthias's point, Nestle and companies like Colgate are making good headway. And the part that I particularly like to see was the innovation in products and responding to consumer demands. But I think where they're lagging maybe in this area is really the education to consumers to help grow that demand. As was stated, I think, scope 3 emissions, the use of products is such a large part of the emissions. So there has to be more education and more sort of creating the demand for those types of products. And then, I think that we are all lagging a bit in incorporating issues of just transition and environmental justice. We really do start to need incorporating those factors if we want to see an orderly climate transition. So you can see this, even from other indexes like the Fortune 500, where the best score in the social aspect of companies only achieves about half of the potential points available, whereas the next closest is further behind when you're looking at sort of the consumer product sector. So I think, if we can get more drive for demand for less carbon intensive products, more education, and then also more focus on a just transition, the companies would be better positioned.
Maybe just a small addition here, Rosie. Yeah, so I fully agree with what Emily said, and I think I also want to just highlight one key finding also from the report, which I fully agree with, is in terms of the CapEx alignment. I think that's indeed an area where the companies have a lot of work to do. Even Nestle, which is quite transparent in its net zero roadmap, they just provide a high-level figure. So they say, okay, our transition plan is going to cost us 3.2 billion by 2025, but then there's no context. And I think that's already better than many other food companies which don't put any CapEx figures on paper. So I think a bit more detail would be really helpful. And indeed, I think the second big gap, what I see is the food waste issue. We have seen in the report it's a huge climate change issue, but it has also huge mitigation potential. But what I've seen also from some of the other companies I was in touch with is that the industry is at the moment really in this kind of pilot phase. So they do a little bit something here, they have one pilot there, there's a university startup thing there, but there's no systematic approach to tackle this issue. There's also no approach across sectors, for example, with retail or hospitality. So I think that's definitely a big gap which has to be addressed by the industry.
Fantastic, thanks both. Emily, one question for you. As we mentioned in our report, the guidance we've developed can also be applied to extend to household personal product companies like Colgate Palmolive, especially as it relates to those companies' agricultural supply chains, where there's huge potential for deforestation exposure, commodities like palm oil, soy oil, beef tallow. Where do you see the potential to leverage this report in these tangential industries?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, I think there's a good deal of recommendations from this report that can be leveraged in these tangential industries. For example, all household and personal product companies could benefit from integrating climate action into core decision-making processes. We're actively engaging companies on ensuring, there is clear board oversight on climate action with appropriate remuneration links to achieve climate targets and goals. And back to what Matthias was saying, aligning CapEx and product development and R&D with a 1.5 degree scenario would also make these companies, well positioned for the future and attracting really future consumers. Integrating things like life cycle assessments could be key here, seeing as most companies in the subsector that I'm in, the household and personal products, as I said before, most of the scope 3 emissions come from post-consumer use of products. So that's something that, I think this report addresses well and can be leveraged. And I think lastly, and this would apply really to all sectors, is the use of this guide to partner with peers, suppliers, and policymakers to drive transformation across different sectors. No sector or subsector is going to be able to do this on their own, just as no company can do it on their own. So partnerships and collaborations are key, as are international and national climate policies.
Definitely, there collaboration a huge part of Climate Action 100 initiative, clearly. Turning it back to you, Matthias, from your perspective, what are the key sort of remaining issues, the remaining barriers you feel need to be addressed in the food and beverage sector to mitigate climate change, to make credible, quantifiable, ambitious changes?
Yeah, I think there are quite a few issues which have to be tackled by the sector. I think one important aspect that really needs to be clarified is, in my view, the role of offsets or nature-based solutions, because I think there's a bit of a hype at the moment around these offsets, and everyone is going to plant trees, and then we don't actually have the space to plant all these trees. So I think that's something that needs to be tackled. At the same time, it's of course a very interesting field, because there are innovative tools available, ranging indeed from tree planting, but also agroforestry, where you combine agricultural techniques with tree planting. There's also an interesting pillar in Nestle's strategy around silvopastures, or where you actually combine tree planting with animal grazing, because that also does make sense and creates a lot of synergies. There's a lot of money flowing into the restoration of forests and peatlands. So I think there are tools available, and there's definitely a bit of a hype around it. So I think what would be really helpful is to have clear guidance on how is the offset potential of these nature-based solutions counted? Who gets the credit? So is it then the local farmer? Is it the cooperative where the local farmer belongs to? Or is it the buyer of the crop, or indeed the end users? Or how can these offsets be traded and aggregated? So I think around the mechanics of that field, that there needs to be a bit more transparency. That would help also our engagements. This would allow us to really see, okay, is this a credible plan by a food and beverage company? Because they all are partly based on these nature-based solutions. And one big hope we have here is that especially the work of this task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets by Mark Carney will allow us, or will enable us, to clarify some of these aspects. And I think that would really benefit the whole industry, because that's a big elephant in the room, I think, for the sector at the moment.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, this is sort of an issue that goes way beyond the food and beverage sector as well. What was it recently, the forests purchased for carbon credits burning recently in wildfires? I mean, it's devastating, but does really raise these sort of bigger sort of moral questions around it. Like you say, who receives this, the benefit, or who is that attributable to? So yeah, both valid for the food and beverage sector and beyond, I think, as well. Emily, turning back to you now, I know this report particularly has a sort of focus on indicator 5 of the C100 plus benchmark, which is, as Narco mentioned earlier, decarbonization strategy. But I noticed in the report, in the feedback you provided on the report, that you mentioned that corporate policy engagements and particularly trade associations are a really key component to the sector's alignment with a net zero future. I was wondering if you could share any particular examples you've come across, maybe of negative lobbying in the food and beverage sector, anything particularly that companies should avoid or continue.
Yeah, definitely. The thing is, I think that we cannot underestimate the fact that, the world's largest food and agriculture corporations have enormous power over the food system and really the rules that govern it. And they use that power in the political arena to its advantage by lobbying policymakers and funding political campaigns. And there's very little oversight to that. And so, as far as negative lobbying, I would say that there has been a long history, maybe not on the climate side, but of, lobbying around nutritional value, content, marketing towards children, those food items that might not be very healthy. But I think it is starting to, bleed into the climate policy and just the fact that there's not a lot of transparency around it. I think recently the type of action we saw from companies following the January 6th US Capitol riot is a good example of where companies actively assess the alignment of their political spending with their mission and values in a very transparent way. And I'd like to see companies doing the same when evaluating their climate strategies and political contributions. Right now it's coming, sort of from outside. So Influence Map is a good source for this. And I think the key is really transparency and highlighting those areas where your trade associations and or lobbying dollars are misaligned, and really how the company remedies that when they find those conflicts. So it's not just enough to say that like we as a company don't engage in significant lobbying and or trade associations, but you really have to exhibit that. And I think Unilever actually really stands out here and has taken an active approach to addressing potential misalignments. I think it was 2019 when its CEO wrote an open letter to the company's industry associations, asking them to confirm alignment of their climate positions with those of Unilever and the 1.5 degree scenario ambition set out in the Paris Agreement. Now, the company did not go on to publicly disclose that review of its industry association alignment on climate change. But I think, just putting that out in the public and making it clear from, the CEO top down that they're expecting alignment with their trade associations is a good first step. We would like to see sort of the transparency then followed through with that review then being publicly disclosed.
Certainly, yeah. I think it's certainly an area, like you said as well, where many of these food and beverage companies have plenty of room to improve as well. Matthias, did you have anything to add there, perhaps on either best or worst practices for positive lobbying that the food and beverage sector or consumer product sector leaders should be modeling?
Not much. I fully agree with Emily. This is a key topic across all sectors. Whenever we engage now on climate transition plans, we always want to see a position paper on their lobbying positions, and we also advocate for really having really explicitly this review of lobbying associations. And I think it's also something that we want to push further with Nestle, because specifically for this company, this is an issue where they're a little bit discreet. So I think any transparency in that area is absolutely crucial.
Great, thank you. So perhaps a nice sort of final question to wrap up for both of you, really. From your perspectives, what are the priority engagement topics you would like to see companies with agricultural supply chains addressing in the next year? Perhaps Emily first.
Thanks, Rosie. Yeah, honestly, there are many, and I think this report really highlights that there are quite a few issues that we could all focus on. But what I think is most important is that we take a holistic approach, right? That's what I would like to see companies doing, and not try to tackle these issues in silos. So there is no one solution to the climate crisis, and so I wouldn't want to see companies thinking about like regenerative agriculture or biodiversity. It's not innovation or recycling. These are all ands. And if we really want to achieve a net zero future, I think that's how companies should be thinking about it. Furthermore, I think the attention does have to be paid to a just transition and climate justice. Like I said before, a holistic approach, because if we want to see an orderly climate transition, we can't leave certain employees or communities behind in that transition. But if I had to highlight just one thing, I would encourage, and it goes to my point above, is for the subsector is to focus more on circular economy business models. While we appreciate, and this is particularly for the household and personal products, we appreciate innovations in design, which allows for more recyclability. But I've read and I heard it said so many times that, we're not going to recycle our way out of this problem. We need to focus on the elimination of waste, and that will take its own innovation as well as education to drive consumer demand. So I guess if I just had one wish, it would be more focus on circular economy business models.
That's great, thanks. And same question to you, Matthias.
Yeah, I think as mentioned before, let's say specifically for Nestle, I think that the lobbying transparency is a key ask, will be a key ask for the next 6 months to really have the company conduct a trade association review. And I think what they also need to do is to link decarbonization targets with executive remuneration. It's not something that they do at the moment explicitly, so that will be these will be two key asks specifically for Nestle. Broader thinking in broader terms for the sector, I think CapEx alignment will be a key ask, because I think ultimately investors, when they make their investment decision, they really need to see where the money is going, and then in order to be really able to decide, is this something I want to invest in or not? And I think the CapEx transparency needs to be up to par as with for traditional financial metrics. And finally, what I also think for the sector, what will be absolutely important, is that the industry takes indeed this takes an ownership approach when it comes to their value chain. So as Emily said, it's not something that has to be solved issue by issue, but it needs to be solved in an integrated way. And I think the food industry, because there are many big names with large purchasing power, they do have a lot of leverage to really take ownership of the value chain. So I think they really need to use this leverage and change the food system, because they can do it. I don't think that the small holders at the beginning of the value chain can do it. But so these food industry titans, they can really teach the smallholders how to farm carefully. They can finance some initial endeavors. They can also push growers and traders to adopt sustainability standards. So they do really have a lot of levers to push the industry forward. But I think it's not just upstream. They also have levers downstream, as was mentioned before. They can educate their consumers. They can launch new and very tasty products, which are indeed then plant-based. I think that's a little bit where they have to go, because this then in turn will also enable other parts of the industry like hospitality or retail to decarbonize. And really taking this value chain perspective, I think it is a key ask. And if you get these big food companies to take ownership of the value chain, I think that would be really a priority for the sector. If you achieve that, we have achieved a lot.
Yeah, thank you. I think just from everything you both highlighted, I think it's really clear that in the food and beverage sector, there's both. It's kind of like I said at the beginning, you've got these sort of internal points of focus to engage upon to really sort of shape the company itself, but then these more bigger sort of external strategic questions about how you use that to shape the industry more broadly as a whole, and how to push forward the decarbonization of the industry in a broader way. So I think that's particularly exciting. But yeah, lots of food for thought, if you'll pardon the pun. But yeah, I think that nicely sort of brings us to the end of our panel discussion today. So thank you so much both for your thoughtful responses. Yeah, perhaps turning back over to you, Meryl.
Thanks, Rosie, and thank you so much. It was a really fascinating discussion, and I really appreciated both of your insights into the sector and decarbonization levers. We've had a few questions come in from the audience while you've been speaking, so I'll start with some of those. This first one actually gets to the point Rosie was just making about sort of the broader systemic changes that are needed. Someone asked, commodity supply chains, which are often global in scale, maybe at the whim of regional policies. And this is also going back to the points you made about lobbying and policy alignment. How, if at all, should companies take action to foster sustainable landscapes globally? And how else could companies use their power to make landscape level changes? So I'll put that to either Emily or Matthias, whoever would like to answer that one.
I can start here, and maybe Matthias can add his comments too. But I think it goes to the last point Matthias was making on supply chain and value chain really engagement. So really encouraging transparency and traceability globally, which I understand is really difficult to do. But I think here is where we could really lean into our engagements with companies and make sure that they're just not having policies in place and making commitments, but they're following through with that with some high level of due diligence. And so I think, as I said, sort of transparency and traceability is something that the large global food producers and household and personal products producers can encourage throughout the global value chain.
Thanks, Emily. Matthias, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, maybe just a brief thought on specifically also now from the perspective of Nestle. So sometimes when they're operating in places where, for example, cocoa or palm oil is growing, of course, they operate in countries which, have in terms of governance just not the same stability. And sometimes what we heard from our discussions with manager and also people in the field is that they act a little bit almost like the government there, because they educate the people, they fund projects. Sometimes they build schools because they have an interest in having educated workers. So that gives them also some leverage. So I think what I would like to see more from these big companies is indeed first be transparent how they deal with governments, but then also actually use their leverage to facilitate improvements. In some places they're the biggest employer. I think they can also use their power and talk to the government and push for strong governance and push for the rule of law. I think they can be a little bit more vocal on that field, and then maybe also help to circumvent weak governance systems.
Thanks, really, really thoughtful answers to that. Sort of a related question. Matthias, you were talking earlier about companies taking ownership of the value chain and providing incentives for farmers and helping finance that transition. And that's something that we really heard throughout the development of this paper from the expert committee and the investors involved, is the need for some of these large multinational companies to really help drive the transition on the ground. So have you seen any examples or have any ideas of how companies can actually help drive finance to agricultural producers to support that shift in practices that's needed, whether it's stopping deforestation or regenerative agriculture?
Yeah, I think this is indeed a very important task that these global food companies have. I think by building local capacity, I think that's one of the biggest levers that they have, because not only are their suppliers then becoming more efficient, so that also helps them, especially when we see a squeeze in the market, like we have seen for cocoa several times now. But it also prepares them for the future, because many of these regions or in coastal areas, in very hot and humid areas. So there's also this physical dimension of climate risk, which will really impact the supply chains of these big companies. And if they already now invest in local capacity building, I think that will help them in the long run to make their supply chains more resilient. So in my view, it's really a win-win. It's for the smallholders, but it's also for the food companies beneficial. So for me, this is absolutely a must, and I think it's also economic. It does make economic sense to do it.
And might I add here, Meryl, and this is something that the report highlights, is that there are other sectors that can be engaged around this issue too. So the financial services sector, for example, they have a huge role to play in being able to, provide finance, particularly in emerging markets, for transitional loans or financing like this. So we can't rule out sort of engagement with the financial services sector around this, and really sort of augmenting the impact that we can all have through engagement.
Thanks. Really good point, both of you, Matthias, especially about the intersection between reducing emissions and also improving resilience, and it being in the best interest of companies. And then also, the engagement with other sectors as well, the banking sector. And I should note actually that Ceres just published a report on incentives for no deforestation and how companies can help support that. So you can check that out as well, those who are tuning in. So we have a couple more questions coming in. One, Beatrice is asking about packaging in the food industry, and the present system produces a lot of waste in terms of packaging. And what are some of the levers that food companies might have to address that issue?
It's a regular topic when we discuss these issues with Nestle, and I think they've started to do a lot more. They have set some targets for the use of recycled packaging. I think what sometimes is a little bit difficult is to really make the business case to one individual company, because of course they want to have a level playing field, but if all of a sudden their packaging costs 30% more in a sector which has very tight margins, I think it's difficult. So then I think it has to go back a little bit to what Emily says in terms of, yes, it's very important to have this circular approach and develop circular packaging, but it needs to be really across the industry, and it needs to be not just maybe the traders or not just the food producers, but also then in the end the retail and the gastronomy and the hospitality. So there needs to be sector approach, and also maybe ultimately there needs to be a little bit of regulation on this side. So we shall see what's happening with in the European Union with the taxonomy, which also has this a little bit this angle. So that might be something which helps out. I'm not sure if you have a different point of view here, Emily.
No, I think you got it. And, one thing I think that also the food industry has to consider too is that, the packaging directly relates to food waste also, right? So there's a balancing act between having the appropriate packaging, but also not wasteful packaging. But, again, I think that it's a complex problem to solve, of course.
Yeah, really good point about that, the intersection between food waste and packaging. So let's tackle one last question, which is, both of you have talked about technological options. Matthias, you mentioned the Starling technology used by Nestle for monitoring deforestation. And you both mentioned the importance of aligning CapEx and R&D with the transition. And some of the emissions in this sector, as highlighted in the report, are fairly difficult to tackle. Emissions like enteric methane from cows or nitrous oxide from fertilizer. So to what degree do you expect companies in the sector to really drive, the potential technological developments that might be needed to tackle some of those difficult sources of emissions, versus, perhaps just adopting already available technologies?
Shall I go first?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick thought here. I think technology will be important, and I think there's a bit of a push across the industry towards digitalization. There's also what I've thought what was quite interesting, some pilots around the using ledger technology to really have full transparency across the supply chain, because ledger technology reduces the cost of really having this traceability a lot. So I'm pretty much convinced that there will be this convergence between new technological developments and the food industry. That being said, I think for the time being, and still for quite some years, there will also be companies will use a lot of approximations, because I think it will be a little while until it will be possible to actually have actual measurements of methane emissions in dairy production. So that's, I think, just to be also realistic.
Yeah, great point. Go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think the sort of nearest term technological advancements that we could use in this space is really along the lines of, traceability, understanding exactly where different commodities are coming from, and being able to sort of follow that all the way through the value chain. But otherwise, I have to admit that I don't really. I'm not an expert in different types of emissions and how those can be best assessed. So I would kind of fall back on the, where we can get transparency and traceability through the supply chain would probably be a good place to sort of focus technological advancement in the near term.
Really good points. Well, I'm going to wrap up here so that we can still have a little bit of time for some other updates, but thank you all so much, Matthias, Emily, Rosie, and Nako, for being with us. And thank you so much to all of our attendees for joining us today as well. Just to note that you can find the report on the Climate Action 100 website. I pasted it in the chat earlier on, so I encourage everyone to check it out. If you're going to read one section, check out the investor recommendations in section 5. I think that's really the key crux of the report, and has a lot of really fantastic information. And just to also note, the next Global Sector Strategies report is on electric utilities, and that will be coming out in October. So keep an eye out for that on the Climate Action 100 website as well. So thank you all so much for being with us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.